Chicago's Morning Answer continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. No Amy today, just me. So the big NATO summit and big boy conference following the NATO summit, Biden last night. Seems appropriate since he created NATO in 1949, so I understand from him. And he said, look, all these NATO allies, the heads of these states, saying, Joe, you got to win. They're not saying, Joe, you got to go. They're not concerned about Joe's leadership and thus the leadership of the free world, saying you got to win. That's what he said. And so his job on Thursday night was to reassure our NATO allies all rooting for Joe. And I'm sure some of them are. That's not the same thing as saying that they have confidence in him. Reassure them and reassure the American people that he's up to the task. Here's how he does it, he said.
Sir, how can you reassure the American people that you won't have more bad nights, whether they be on a debate stage or on some matter of foreign policy?
Well, I tell you what, the best way to assure them is the way I assure myself. And that is, am I getting the job done? Am I getting the job done? Can you name me somebody who's gotten more major piece of legislation passed in 3.5 years? I created 2,000 jobs just last week.
I mean, I love that. One of my favorite lines is politicians talking about all the jobs they create. And both parties do this. I can't stand it. I created 2,000 jobs last week. How'd you do it? Well, I'd love to hear the story. Please, details. Well, it didn't reassure people very much. And this, of course, these cuts are the leads coming out of the press conference when he can't remember who the president of Ukraine is. He can't even remember who his vice president is.
And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. He's going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway, Mr. President.
I'm better.
You are a hell of a lot better.
That wasn't uncomfortable. And he followed that up with his gem. At least he, with respect to Zelensky, he was actually able to hear himself when he said President Putin, or somebody screamed from off stage. I'm not sure which.
What concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there.
Let's start there with Dominic Green, columnist for the Washington Examiner, contributor to the Wall Street Journal, and fellow of the Royal Historical Society as well. Dominic, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hello, Dan.
So Joe Biden's fan club there, all of the heads of state of our NATO allies, of America's NATO allies, how do you think they felt after that performance? Reassured?
I should think they felt ashamed and alarmed, ashamed for their part in this ongoing farce, and alarmed because this was an attempt to send a strong and unified image of NATO and the American-led order, and instead it's an absurdity, and these foreign leaders knowingly are playing along and misleading their own publics, if anyone's able to actually believe it, because we all now see it with our own eyes. The President of the United States is manifestly unfit for the office.
And the other thing, too, is, I mean, as much as Trump is destructive of NATO, he worked into the conversation all he's done to advance the strength and increase the membership of the alliance, and how destructive Trump is, and he won't guarantee that he'll support NATO and so on and so forth. Yet this year, 24 of NATO allies are on track to meet or exceed the 2% of GDP each country committed a decade ago to spend on defense. Canada's the only one, or one of the few, that isn't close. But the pressure Trump put on NATO allies to live up to their commitments, that has borne fruit, and that's actually strengthened the alliance because he compelled our America's allies to pony up.
Yeah, it's a simple matter of fact that when Trump came in, hardly any of NATO's members were paying that 2% of GDP on defense. Britain and Poland and Estonia, I believe, at one point were the only countries to be doing this. And now they're saying, as you said, two-thirds of them, something like 24, 25 countries are now paying that. And others, such as Britain, are now talking about getting up to 3% even by the end of the decade. There is absolutely no question that all of this is a result of Donald Trump frightening them out of their lives, really, by the prospect of withdrawing the American umbrella. And this has nothing to do with Joe Biden at all. What does have to do with the Biden administration is expanding NATO to include Finland and Sweden, which in fact vastly increases the American commitment to defend Europe at a time when many people are pointing out that a much more serious threat to America's position in the world is coming from the Pacific, not from old Europe.
Speaking of Britain, I mean, the results in Western Europe, we want to talk about that. I mean, we talked to you about it in advance of the elections. It was completely anticipated that conservatives would take it on the chin, as they did in the UK. But maybe a little bit less unanticipated that Nigel Farage would have such a good night. So, what is the status of the Conservative Party in England after that election?
Well, the Conservative Party is in complete shambolic disarray. This was the worst defeat they've ever had. It calls into question what kind of party they will be in the future. They have a choice now. They can either keep on this track of basically being an alternative version of Labour. We have two centrist parties, both believing in high taxes and slow growth and wokeism and so on, or they can actually go back to being the Conservative Party of Margaret Thatcher, which, judging from this election, is actually what people want. The Reform Party, which was really invented out of thin air as a vehicle for Nigel Farage, Mr. Brexit. The Reform Party got 14% of the votes. At short notice, they didn't even have enough people to field as candidates in all the constituencies. So you can imagine how well they would have done with a proper ground game and proper investment and a plan, which is now actually what they're working on. So the Conservatives have a choice. They're either going to be rendered into this sort of boutique party for the centre-right, or they can turn rightwards, return to their roots and their principles, and probably sweep the board quite easily. Because this was a victory for Labour, because the public is disgusted at the way the Conservatives have betrayed them on various things, on the economy, on immigration, on everything, really. This was a washing of the hands. This was not an embrace of Labour, who in the last week have started handing out citizenship to illegal immigrants, opening the prisons, and saying they're not going to drill for any more oil. So the lights will go up quite soon if they actually stick to this course. Well,
so are they going to try to fold Farage in, or is he a transitory figure and there's some new generation of conservative leadership in the offing?
Well, we've got a bit of both, because there are some very good young people, all of them incidentally descended from recent immigrants into the UK. Suella Braverman, Kemi Badenoch, Priti Patel, they're all potential party leaders. They're all Thatcherites, and they easily could do without him in a way, because they would be on his turf. But in terms of this populist right swing for Farage, it's very much about him and what he wants to do. And he has been, this is the third party in a decade that he's effectively invented on the back of an envelope. You have to wonder if ultimately he wants to take over the Conservative Party. And there are people on the party's right who would like him to join them. And either of those things would leave us with a Conservative Party that looks like the parties of the right in Europe, or even the Republicans in the US. So it's a question of how we get there. But I do believe this will happen by public demand.
And the impact of the maneuvering that Macron did in France to stave off the Conservatives there.
Well, this is a real self-inflicted injury. Macron lost control of the parliament in the 22 elections, and after these European elections, in which Marine Le Pen and the National Rally, the populist right party, came out first, he called these snap elections to try and catch everybody off balance and reassert his control. But the opposite has happened. Marine Le Pen won the first round of the French vote, and then in the second round, Macron's party basically colluded with the Islamists and communists and environmental fanatics of the left-wing alliance. They stood down each other's candidates to make sure that Le Pen wouldn't win. And it worked in the sense that Le Pen's party came third, but now Macron's party, not the biggest in the parliament, and are having to negotiate with the communists. And I'm not exaggerating when I say the communists. You know, their leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is actually a communist and is now talking about bringing in a 90% taxation rate in France, talking about spending billions of euros that France simply doesn't have. And indeed, the markets are already starting to warn France that they may well, have a similar event to the one that happened in Britain, where Liz Truss became Prime Minister, tried to spend lots of money she didn't have, and you were warned, well, you're going to go bankrupt, we're going to pull all our investments. So France is really teetering, and Macron has played a major role in undermining it.
The conventional wisdom is the center is crumbling, and this is very concerning because it harkens back to the rise of totalitarian regimes in the first part of the 20th century. But if the left wants to throw in with the neo-Marxists and be revolutionaries in places like France or Britain, for that matter, they can do that, and then you can have alternative examples too, perhaps more moves like Argentina with Milei. Next year, for example, Canada has a presidential election, and Pierre Poilievre is looking pretty good against Macron, and that would represent, I think, based on what I've seen from Poilievre, something on the order of a Milei victory in Canada. So, I mean, if that's the way that the West wants to do it, is present these sort of extreme, I wouldn't say extreme because I don't think being free market oriented is extreme, but these stark contrasts in terms of how to order a free society, then everybody can chart their course.
Yeah, and it's the contrast that people think is extreme. I don't believe there's anything particularly ideologically extreme about any of these people. I think the reason that they are doing so well at the ballot box is because they represent the center of public opinion. And it so happens that the people who run things, and I say that, I don't mean our elected leaders, because they have to respond to public opinion. I'm talking about the vast bureaucracies which actually run our states. The people who run things have drifted far to the left, and every time somebody objects, they're called fascist or racist or far right. But it's simply not true. And as you're saying, the real radicalization which has occurred is within our institutions, and it is the hard left which has taken them over by degrees over decades, because they couldn't win at the ballot box, because ideas of individual freedom, free markets, law and liberty, because these things are actually quite popular with voters. Because of that, the left had to take over the institutions. And it's going to take decades to winkle them out, and it's going to be a long struggle. And what we're seeing now is the early phases of it.
Dominic Green is a columnist for the Washington Examiner, contributor to the Wall Street Journal, and fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Dominic Green, thank you as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.
And Dominic Green joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
The more you listen, the more you'll know. This is Chicago's Morning Answer. Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Getting quality employees to fill positions in your company is essential, but finding those people can be a major hassle, unless you use ZipRecruiter. ZipRecruiter makes finding quality people a breeze. And right now you can try it for free at ZipRecruiter.com/free.